How did you guys pull off the Escher sequence at the end?
Yeah, the Escher sequence is about storyboarding. It's not one set. It was little bits all around the stage, and it's very, very clever. The shots where David goes around is a stuntman who has a pole going up one leg, and he's got a strap around him, and he actually went down and around upside down. There are a couple of opticals in that, but not many. The baby is often a puppet being worked upside down, so that you could see Jennifer one way, and she'd look up, and the baby would be upside down and crawling would be a puppet that was being worked through the floor, from above. So we just broke it down into shot by shot by shot, and then the ball was optical. The ball, when it bounces around, is often not really there.
I heard some shouts of concern when Toby gets tossed into the air during Magic Dance.
I know, it's so unfair. Because my dad, and again, he loved that sort of thing. He and Maurice loved that sort of thing. And that's, why he's got the thank you and the special thanks to Maurice and for inspiration is because my dad did realize he was largely inspired by Maurice, a lot of Maurice's ideas in that movie. And they'd been really good friends. And that's largely why that credit is there. Now, what was the question I was answering? Where were we starting?
I was just talking about tossing
the baby. Yes. Well, tossing babies is funny. Of course it is. It happens all the time in Maurice Sendak books. Well, we didn't think it's a puppet, of course. And when little Toby Froud, because it was Brian's son who played the baby, when he's crying in the middle of the goblins, people also worry about that. But literally 2 feet in front of him is his mother, who's looking through a little window, who can reach out and touch him. So it's not that he was actually alone or scared. But then when they're tossing the baby, it's a fake baby, and my dad, it's just his sense of humor. It was just fun and a naughty thing to do. But boy, did we get a couple of newspapers in England just slayed us for it. Slayed us. And I did a most horrible interview where they were just saying, well, this is a movie about child abuse. And I was like, really? It's about child abuse? I don't really think it is.
This film has the first ever digitally created creature.
With the owl? Was it the first ever? Probably. Here we are in the George Lucas Theater. I don't know. If you tell me it was, it probably was. It was certainly super, super early. Was first ahead of this?
What did they do in Young Sherlock? Oh, yeah, but as far as trying to represent a real animal.
Although it's not a great representation of a real animal, it's kind of stylized. But definitely my dad was into it, but it was very early days. And it is a puppet. We did do a puppet of that owl too, which is there a little bit, but it's digital obviously during the title sequence. And they were developing the technology even as we were shooting, and that didn't come in, some of that stuff that the owl was doing, until we were in post. It wasn't even possible, I think.
What was, could you get a sense of what George's influence was?
Well, yes, I think, again, it was really about probably the owl. I think that was probably largely George working that with my dad, but it was coming off of Dark Crystal and my dad wanting to answer this call from the public of, I wish it was more entertaining, I wish it was more fun, and anyway, so my dad paired up with George, I think just to see what would happen, and also my dad, I guess they had already made Empire Strikes Back, right? And my dad and George, yes? Yeah. And my dad and George got pretty close during that. And my dad helped a whole lot with Stuart, Yoda, who made Yoda, Stuart Freeborn? Yeah, Stuart was working in London. And so what happened was my dad did Dark Crystal. And then basically, and this is why he then created the Creature Shop, was he made Dark Crystal, and then George hired them all to make Empire Strikes Back. And then my dad hired them all back to make Labyrinth. And then he said, and now I have a Creature Shop, so they're staying with me. But my dad got very involved with Stuart Freeborn, and then a lot of the people from Dark Crystal went over there, and Frank, of course, went in to perform Yoda. And I think it was then that my dad and George were just talking about doing something together. But this one was really my dad's film that George came into. But I do think between the two of them, they also had a lot of control. I think my dad was not real happy with the studio presence on Dark Crystal and the process of previewing Dark Crystal. Dark Crystal, the only English spoken, was meant to be the Gelflings, and the Gelflings, and then the mystics at the beginning when they're speaking Gelfling to the Gelflings, and Aughra because she can speak Gelfling. But the whole idea was only the Gelfling spoke English, and the language was Gelfling, and a few other characters could speak Gelfling. And the first time my dad showed it to Universal, the executives stood up and walked out of the room. They didn't know what to say to him because they thought he was insane and had lost his mind. And they basically said, they've all got to speak English. And then the problem with that, when you watch Dark Crystal now, like, is there are scenes that are not, you're not meant to be able to understand what's being said. And instead what happens is with the Skeksis death scene, like when the Skeksis dies, you have all these other Skeksis going, is he dying? Oh, I think he's dying. Is he dying? Who will be the next king? I will be the next king. You will not be. I'll be the next king. It's like, oh my God, the dialogue is killing me. And then, you know, and it's because it was all in a foreign language, and you were meant to be, you know, it was all in a fake language, and you were meant to be figuring out what's going on. And instead, all of a sudden, the Skeksis are speaking English. And I think that whole thing sort of really bugged my dad. So by having George on board with him, they really had control of the picture, too. And then, I know during editorial, George, during shooting, he'd come over quite a bit and visit and sort of engage with my dad. And I think on the scripting, I think he was giving his thoughts and all. But really, George is an editor. He really likes to edit. So what was happening was my dad would edit, and George would be editing in San Francisco, and they'd sort of hand sequences back and forth, which in those days meant airplane with film canisters, so that you can see what George is doing. You know, in those days there was no way to like email it like you can now. It was like, well, I'll send you my version of Reel 1. It'll be there in 3 weeks.
But tell us a little bit about the mechanics of doing a character like Hoggle. When you see you've got multiple puppeteers performing different tasks to bring the character to life, what does that mean, and how has that changed so that if you were to do something like that now, what major differences would you see? Well,
it's animatronics, and there's not that much animatronics being done anymore. But coming off of Labyrinth, and then over the subsequent years, the problem with animatronics, Little Shop of Horrors, we had probably 8 people to work the head alone. Dream Child probably had 20 people working that Mad Hatter head, and it's really, really hard. You have to rehearse for weeks to just do one scene. It did get to with Hoggle, there was 4 of us doing just the face, and then Sherry inside, and all 5 of us had to be in perfect sync, which of course is impossible. It just requires a lot of rehearsal, a lot of time. And in those days, people did rehearse for a movie for 4 or 5 months. And nowadays, people rehearse for 1 or 2 weeks. But so we kind of had the time, because those big movies, they didn't happen in post the way big movies. Now big movies all happen in post. in those days, big movies all happened in preparation. So you would pre-produce a movie for a year. You would storyboard it, and there'd be 8 different versions of every set so that you could pull off every shot. And so we would just have to rehearse a lot. What we did later was we developed a performance control system that allows one performer to perform through mechanical puppet hand controls, so that one performer can perform 45 motors. Whereas when we were doing Labyrinth, we had just come out of cable controls. We were still using a lot of cable controls, but Dark Crystal was almost all cable controls except for maybe the eyes, and that meant one performer could basically pull. You could do a T-bar, and you could basically pull and push 2 to 4 cables with one hand, and that was not very much movement. So you just had to keep adding more and more people to control the animatronics, and that meant it was very hard to rehearse, very hard to get it and not have something screw up, and you'd try to do a line and somebody say, "I'm so sorry, I went the wrong direction with the upper lip on the left." It's like, oh, that's why he suddenly sneered in the middle of the line. No, so you had to just rehearse, and then with Labyrinth, we started adding a lot more motor control and trying to condition the movement of the motor so they look less mechanical. They're still looking pretty mechanical here. They got less mechanical by the time we got to Ninja Turtles. And then Dinosaurs, they were the TV series. That was very ambitious because we had 12 big animatronic characters trying to do a weekly television series. And by then, we were firmly into the performance control systems where all the movements were motor driven. And then one performer could perform a lot more of the motors. And you could pre-program so that if you could move your controls to mean happy and excited, and you had already pre-programmed what the 35 motors would do to create that, so that you were able to start performing more instinctively and emotionally through the puppet, rather than always having to think, eyebrow up means pinky up, other eyebrow up, eyelids down. Up until then, it was just training your hand to do all these crazy shapes.